In this video, I'm going to show the process of sculpting a little garden snail. I'll be going through the steps that I usually take when I build a sculpture, and I'm also going to be going over any helpful things that I've learned over the years about sculpting. So I have broken down my sculpture process into 5 steps. Step 1 is inspiration and knowing your project. Step 2 is building a basic shape. Step 3 is smoothing your basic shape. Step 4 is eyes, and step 5 is texture. I'll be going over these steps as we progress through this project. So the first step here would be inspiration and knowing your project. So normally I would look up pictures of snails, all different kinds of snails, real pictures and different kinds, and make up my mind on my initial design. I would write it down in a sketchbook and just give a general idea what I was going to make. It is very hard to sculpt things just from your memory. In your mind, you may think you know what a snail looks like, but you actually need pictures of real life snails to really get the inspiration, the shape, and the idea correct. So I've already built a snail, so this is actually kind of a recreation of a larger project I've already done. So I already kind of have things worked out on how I want them built, and so I didn't really need to do any research for this little guy. Step 2 is the step that I'm on right now, which is building your basic shape. So you need step 1 to know what your basic shape is, and step 2 you need to build it. You just need a general idea of the shape of your object. The idea isn't to make it look exactly like a picture or multiple pictures. The idea is to use those pictures as inspiration for an idea that you have of your own. So when I'm building, I usually make my pieces cartoony or simplified, which is a look I like, but it also makes it an easier build. And when you're dealing with concrete, you want a solid build. You don't want thin pieces because it ruins the concrete's strength. Now, the best part about sculpture is the ability to do it until you get the look that you want. When I first started sculpture, I would spend months working on one piece because I would just redo it until it had the look that I liked. So it's very forgiving in that aspect. As you're building on to your shape, keep looking back at your pictures and your inspiration or your journaling to decide how you're going to continue with your piece. A snail is a pretty easy piece. I mean, basically, I'm going to simplify him by putting a large circular shell on his back, and then he's going to basically have a sluggy kind of body. I like to build up my clay into the depth that I prefer, but there's lots of different methods for building. You can start out with the general shapes that are already proportioned the way that you want, or you can just start with a kind of a blob and add on to it, which is what I usually do. I'm not sure what this looks like right now, but it's not a snail. An important sculpting tip that I have learned over the years is sculpting evenly. So when you have one side, this creature is symmetrical, you want to sculpt the other side at the same time. It just makes it easier for your pieces to be symmetrical, and then they look more realistic or whatever you're going for. If you do one side of it at a time, and a lot of times you will spend more time on the first thing that you do. And so if you start with the right side and you make it exactly how you want, and you turn around and try and do the left side, not only are you going to have a hard time recreating what you did exactly on the right side, but you're going to be tired of doing it by then. So you're going to have 2 different looking sides. So it's much better just to build equally. If you put an indentation on the right, put an indentation on the left. Back to the topic of redoing a piece over and over, like if you don't like the face and you can just redo the face, again and again until you like how it looks. That is not wasted time. The more that you practice with how you want, a look of your piece, the better you're going to be at doing it, and it does transfer over into other pieces. When I first started sculpting, I had a terrible time creating eyes. Eyes were very difficult for me, and I thought they were really important to the piece. I've never been a fan of the dead eyes, where you really don't see a pupil and you don't see the personality and the character that's in the eyes. So I really had to practice them, and they took me a really long time at first just to get them to kind of where I liked them, but now I can do them fairly quickly. Sculpture, like so many other things, is a matter of practice. Practice develops skill, and the more you do, the higher your skill level. And in my opinion, skill is more important than talent. I have never met anybody who is talented without practicing a skill. I feel like talent is just your passion for something. So I'm passionate about sculpting, but I'm not good at sculpting until I practice doing it. And I still have a lot to learn. So right now I'm just building up his basic shape still. There's kind of this flat front side to a snail, and so I'm creating that by just putting these little ribbons of clay on either side. You definitely want to get the big detail in your basic shape. The small detail is what brings the piece together, but you have to have that basic shape first for the small detail to look right. And don't worry about smoothing everything down and taking out all the little nicks and stuff. That's going to be taken care of when we smooth the whole piece at once with water. I should also probably mention that you're going to want a fairly soft clay when you're doing your initial basic shape, just because it's easier. Now I'm going to build up his shell until it reaches the height that I'm looking for. Again, I'm going for a sort of cartoony effect here with the shell. Alright, next is the swirls on the shell. So you'll see that I'm going to do one side and basically just get the basic swirls and then move directly to the other side. Again, you're going to want to do them kind of at the same time so that you're building, a more symmetrical piece. So I'll put the swirls on this side and just kind of get it positioned where I want, and then I will move directly over to the other side. I know this can be hard sometimes because you want to keep messing with it because you want it to kind of get to where you want it to look before you go to the other side. And that's fine, I've done that before. If you kind of want to figure out how you're going to sculpt the other side first, then you can go ahead and do that. But in general, it is easier to just kind of evenly build your piece. Another thing I want to mention is when you're building pieces or sculptures, it's easy to get discouraged when you're looking at what you're doing, because it's like, this doesn't look the way I think it should. But you have to just keep going with it and finish your projects. Even if you don't like them, finish them. It's important and it helps develop your skill. So much of the finish work in the texture is what brings the piece together. They always have such a different look from the basic shape smooth stage to the texture stage. So that's why it's important to go ahead and finish it, even if you're not liking the way it's turning out. And remember, if you don't like how something looks, you do have the ability to re-sculpt it. Just start over, redo the whole face, redo the whole shell, whatever it is that you need to do, you can do it. So I'm going to speed up the rest of this clip because it's just me working on the shell and getting it in the position that I want and the shape that I'm looking for a little cartoon snail. Remember, it's a good idea to keep referencing either the pictures that you have of whatever it is you're building, or if you have sketches or drawings of the idea that you have in mind. For instance, the shell on this snail does not look like a real snail shell, which has kind of a spiral effect and that sort of thing. But I knew what I was going to do. I was going to do something that was simple and cartoony, and this is the second one I've built. So this is a smaller version of a larger snail I already have, so this was a pretty easy build because I'd already done it once and had kind of perfected where I wanted the things on this project. Now that I have the basic idea and shape for the shell, I am going to just carve and add clay to make it exactly how I want it to look, to give it the dimension that I'm looking for. And I also like my pieces to have a good amount of symmetry to them. And so this is just me making the shell the same on both sides and giving them the same look and that same dimension. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how this shell looks now, and pretty much the basic shape in general is where I want it to be. You see I have the eyes on the back of the shell here, and it's a nice solid piece so that when it's poured in concrete there are no brittle parts. I have my green water bottle here, and it is now time for step 3, which is smoothing out your clay of your basic shape. So I have this little cup filled with water, a sponge, and a paintbrush, and I'm going to use them to smooth the clay. You want to get rid of all of the nicks and just make it look really consistent and nice and smooth. There's no small detail on this piece yet, so you don't have to worry about, filling in detail with the water. You can pretty much add as much water as you want, but you just don't want it sitting in water, so afterwards make sure to wipe up any water that's around the base, or it'll just sit and weaken the clay at the bottom of the piece. This method works really well for just kind of finishing up a piece quickly. You don't have to sit and meticulously work out all of the little nicks and stuff in a piece with tools or your hands, which don't reach into the creases and stuff anyway. And it just is a great way to make your piece look really, really solid and clean. I also want to mention that step 3, or the smoothing of the piece, can be done right after you get your basic shape done. So it doesn't really matter how soft the clay is here. You're just wanting to get it smooth and a nice even look on the whole piece. And you're just going to continue to do this until it reaches the state that you like. So I also use this time to straighten out if I think one side of the shell is higher or lower. I'll just move it with my hands. The clay's still pretty soft. It's just a good time to just overall check the symmetry of your piece and make it the way that you want it to look. The piece is done being smoothed, and I'm going to move on to step number 4, which is eyes. Eyes are tricky in sculpture, so I'm gonna start the eyes now. I've let this piece sit for probably like 20 or 30 minutes after I smoothed it out. You don't really want to do anything on the piece until it sits for at least a little bit after you smooth it, because the water softens the outer layer of the clay, which makes it hard to work with. So it's been sitting for about 30 minutes, and I'm gonna go ahead and just do the basic shape of the eyes here while the clay is still soft, and then I'm going to work on the eyes periodically depending on how hard the clay is. I also have some saran wrap down here so I can move the piece around more easily without breaking it or getting stuck to the tile. Now that I have the round part of the eye how I want it, I'm going to add this little underlid part of the eye to make him look like he's happy or smiling. I've already done it to the right eye here, now I'm going to add it to the left eye, and this is just going to give his eyes some more character. Eyes are one of the most important aspects to your statue because it's going to give it emotion and personality that you're going for. It can be difficult at first to get them to look or have the look that you're going for, but there's lots of examples online that you can look at, either for painting them in or for sculpture. One of the hardest part about sculpting eyes is making them symmetrical. It's really easy for one to be bigger than the other, or the pupil to look a little different, and those differences are pretty noticeable. So during this step, it's especially important to kind of work on them both at the same time and at the same stages. So if you circle out one, you circle out the other. If you add a lid to one, you add the lid to the other. Don't finish one eye and then go back and work on the other, because it's going to be really hard to make them look the same. Now that I have the outer shape kind of where I want, I'm going to do the inner circle of an eye. Now, I do this differently depending on the piece. You can wait until the piece is leather hard to do this, and sometimes it's easier to carve it in. I'm going to go ahead and do it now while the piece is really soft, and then I'll have to go back when the piece is harder to put the detail in. So I'm just using the end of one of my paintbrushes with a little bit of water on it to make these symmetrical indentations in the eye, which I will then put a small dauble of clay on each one to give it the look of an eye. Here it is with the clay discs in the eyes. It's pretty much the look I'm going for, but I can't go on because the clay is too soft. So it's time to let it sit till it's leather hard. Okay, so he's been sitting overnight. I did have a bag over the piece so that it did not dry out too quickly. It is not to the leather hard stage yet. And I usually put my texture in a little bit before the leather hard stage. Here you can see the eyes and the piece is nice and smooth. You should be able to handle it. It's not going to be overly fragile at this point, and you can go ahead and put in your detail. So I'm going to try and start my detail, and if it's too soft, then I'm just going to leave him out for a little longer. So this brings us to the last step of the process, step number 5, which is detail or texture. This is the texture tool I almost always use. It's basically kind of a pointer tool that has a little ball on the end of it. It keeps it from gouging the clay like a needle point tool would. So I'm going to start my texture on the shell. It's basically a line texture going away from the spiraling. And I can already tell that this clay is still too soft. So when you're putting in your detail and you have edges that are going to come up from where you're carving, if the edges don't come right off and they're sticky, that means the outer layer of your clay is not hard enough. You want the carvings coming off your detail to kind of be dry and just flake off. Otherwise, your detail's not going to carve in properly. So I'm basically just going to let him sit out for a little while longer until he reaches the consistency that I'm looking for. So he's been sitting out for about half the day now, and I'm liking the look of the consistency of the clay. You can kind of see on the edge of his face here where there's a little bit of gray or white. That's just the outer layers, especially the thinner areas that are drying out. It's not really a big deal if part of your piece dries a little bit faster than another part, as long as it doesn't completely dry. And even then you really could still carve in the detail. It just makes it much harder. So here I'm just going to show you a little test carve on the face, and the little carvings come right off with the paintbrush, and so it looks like it's ready for its detail or texture. So texture is really important on your piece, and to know the specific texture of whatever you're looking at, you're just going to want to pull up pictures and give a general idea of what it is you're going to be carving in. You're going to want to make it as consistent as possible, and you're going to want to pay attention to your size of whatever it is you're carving in. So for instance, if you're carving in scales and the scales get smaller on the face, you need to follow that pattern. Or if you're doing fur, fur has part lines in it, like for a dog around, off the back, you know, it's one's going to come down one side and then it's going to go a different way on the other side. You need to pay attention to those things because it will make a difference when you're carving in your texture. In this instance, it's a pretty easy piece. The shell just gets lines all the way through it, through the spiral. I'm going to start with a larger ball size on the stylus here and just kind of get the angle that I want for each of the lines, and then I'm going to go back through and fill it in with the smaller side to just give it a consistent shell type look. A word of advice for the perfectionists out there: don't let your perfectionism get the better of you on this. If you're worried about every line being straight or every scale being perfect, you will drive yourself crazy. Now I'm going to show the rest of this in stop motion to speed up the process here. So the shell is done. I'm happy with how it looks, so I'm going to move on to the face. You can see it's pretty consistent on both sides and the texture looks good. Now I'm going to start the texture on the face and the body, which is just a sort of wrinkly skin texture. So I'll take a look at whatever example I have, and then I'm just going to use that as a basis for the general shape of the scales or skin or whatever it is you're carving in. I usually start around the eyes or the face with my texture because I'm more careful when I first start than later on after I've been doing it for an hour or more, and so it usually looks better and I'm just more careful in the beginning. And then later, as I get towards the bottom and back where it's not as noticeable, I can be less careful about carving in the texture. Now this makes a big difference in your painting. So I do a dry brush style paint where I have a base coat of black, and the black's going to go into all these little texture lines. So you're going to want them pretty deep. You also want them fairly deep for the latex rubber to really get into the texture. It's not going to, you know, be on the surface level. So I've sort of learned over the years that the deeper your texture is, the easier it is to dry brush it later. The dry brush painting technique for these kind of pieces really make this texture pop. So right now as you're carving it in, it doesn't look that noticeable, but later when all of these little crevices have a black coloration to them, it's going to make your piece come alive. And I'm going to finish off his texture with stop motion as well. And he's all finished. These are all 5 steps, starting with inspiration, number 2 basic shape, number 3 smoothing the clay, 4 is the eyes, and 5 is the last step that we just finished, the texture. I'm just brushing off any little carvings that are still on the piece and going to take a look at him. I'm really happy with how he turned out. He's got some great texture. This is going to look really good with a black base and layers of colored paint. He's quite cute, and I think he's going to be perfect for someone's garden. So that concludes this video on the sculptural part of making concrete statues. My next video is going to be going over latex and molding, and then followed by pouring and painting. I hope these ideas and techniques are able to help somebody out there, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching!